The man walked slowly through the crowded street, his cap pulled low over his face. People moved around him quickly, some bumping past, others staring briefly before looking away. Most of them did not give him a second thought. He wore old clothes, not dirty, but worn out, the kind that suggested he had been living quietly, without anyone really noticing him. He carried a small, tattered bag that swung lightly at his side. There was a calmness about him, strange stillness that made him almost invisible to the world around him. He paused in front of a small public square. At the center, there was an old piano. It sat alone, worn and scratched, its black paint faded in many places. Some of the keys were chipped, others sticky from years of use. People would occasionally try to play it, but most avoided it. Children would run past, laughing, and adults would shake their heads and walk on. It was a place many ignored, a place that had been forgotten by time. The man stood for a long moment, watching the piano. He did not rush, he did not fidget. His eyes lingered on the worn keys, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to fade. The sounds of the street, the chatter, the footsteps, the distant car horns faded to background noise. Only the piano mattered in that moment. He ran his fingers gently along the edge of the piano, as if feeling its soul, though he did not play a note yet. People began to notice him. A few whispered to each other. "Look at him," one said. "Do you think he is homeless?" Another shook their head and walked faster. Some were curious, but most just glanced and ignored him. No one approached. No one asked why he was there. It was as if he had become part of the background, like the benches or the trees. He smiled faintly, slowly lowered his bag to the ground. From inside, he pulled out a small cloth, old and frayed, and carefully began to clean the keys. He did it with patience, with care. The cloth moved across the surface, erasing dust and small stains, almost like he was preparing it for something special. A few onlookers stopped for a moment. Their curiosity piqued. He did not look up at them, did not acknowledge them. His focus was complete. Memories began to stir in him as his hands hovered over the keys. He remembered a time long ago when music had been everything. The piano had once been his closest friend, a companion through lonely nights and quiet mornings. Back then, he had spent hours learning, practicing, perfecting. The sound of a single note could bring tears to his eyes. But life had taken its toll. He had lost people he loved, opportunities that once seemed endless, and slowly the music had been pushed aside. The world had moved on, and he had stepped back. Now, here he was, returned to a place that felt familiar yet changed. A small crowd began to gather, though they did not come close. Some leaned against nearby walls, others peeked from behind corners. They were curious, but unsure of what to expect. A few children pointed at him and whispered to each other. Some adults exchanged glances, skeptical of what was about to happen. No one could have guessed the quiet power of the man in the cap, the story hidden beneath his worn clothes. He finally sat down on the piano bench. It creaked slightly under his weight, but he did not flinch. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and let his hands hover above the keys. The crowd grew silent, sensing something was about to happen. Even the wind seemed to pause, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, with the gentlest touch, he pressed a key. The sound was soft, almost shy, but it carried a warmth that made people stop in their tracks. Another note followed, and then another. Slowly, the music began to take shape. It was not a complex melody, not yet, but it was honest, full of emotion. The man leaned into the piano, his fingers moving with care and precision. Each note told a story that had been hidden away for years. People in the crowd began to shift, drawn by the music. Some stopped in mid-step, others stood still, captivated. It was impossible to look away. The sound was not just music. It was a voice, a heart speaking without words. The man in the cap did not need to say anything. The piano did it for him. For the first time that day, the people around him saw something beyond the disguise. They saw skill, emotion, and a deep, unspoken story. A woman in the crowd wiped a tear from her eye, feeling the power of the simple notes. A young boy tilted his head, listening intently, as if trying to understand what the music was saying. Even those who had been skeptical, whispering doubts about the man, found themselves holding their breath, caught in the unexpected beauty of the moment. The man did not rush. He allowed the notes to flow naturally, letting them speak for him. Each press of the key was deliberate, carrying meaning. His expression remained calm, almost serene, but there was an energy in his hands, a silent passion that could not be ignored. He was no longer invisible. Not really. The music had begun to shine a light on who he was beneath the disguise. The crowd remained silent, mesmerized. Even the children, usually full of movement and chatter, stayed still, listening. The man's eyes opened slightly, glancing around, noticing the faces, the reactions. He did not smile broadly, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. This was why he had returned. This was why the piano had called him back. Minutes passed like moments. The music continued, simple but powerful. The man's presence was calm, yet commanding in its subtlety. No one moved, no one spoke, afraid to break the fragile magic that had formed around the piano. The city, busy and noisy just moments before, seemed to fade away. Only the piano, the man, and the people who had paused to listen existed in that space. Finally, he lifted his hands, letting the last notes hang in the air. Silence returned, but it was different now. People blinked, trying to comprehend what they had just heard. There were no words at first, only stunned looks and a collective intake of breath. Then, slowly, a murmur spread through the crowd, growing into soft applause. It was hesitant at first, then stronger, more confident. The man in the cap nodded slightly, acknowledging the recognition, though he did not speak. His music had said everything he needed to say. After a few moments, he stood, dusted his clothes lightly, and picked up his bag. Without a word, he began to walk away, leaving the piano behind, still echoing the memory of his notes. The crowd watched him go, unsure of what to do next. Some wanted to call out, to ask who he was, but no one did. The magic of the moment was fragile, and words seemed inadequate. As he disappeared into the crowd, the piano remained silent once again, but somehow different. It had been touched by hands that knew it deeply, hands that could bring it to life. People lingered around, still talking in low tones, replaying the notes in their minds. The man in the cap was gone, but the memory of his music lingered, leaving an impression on everyone who had been there in that small square. For a few minutes, the world had stopped noticing appearances and distractions. They had listened, really listened, to someone they had almost ignored. And in those notes, simple yet profound, they had glimpsed the story of a man no one expected. A story that would not be forgotten anytime soon. After leaving the square, the man walked slowly down quiet streets, far from the noise and crowd. He kept his cap low, his eyes scanning the ground but also observing small details. A cracked window, stray dog, children playing in a narrow alley. Every little thing seemed to carry a story, a memory, or a hint of life that was often overlooked. Though the city around him moved quickly, he moved with a rhythm all his own, careful and deliberate, as if every step mattered. He found a small bench near a park and sat, resting his hands on his knees. The piano still echoed in his mind, each note lingering like a gentle whisper. He thought about the people who had watched him play, the surprise in their faces, the unspoken respect that had grown in those few minutes. It had been a small moment, but it mattered deeply to him. Music had always been more than sound. It had been a way to live, to breathe, to connect. Memories began to flow as he sat quietly. He remembered the first time he had touched a piano as a boy. It had been in a small room filled with sunlight, the keys gleaming, almost like a promise. A teacher had guided his fingers, showing him the basics, but it was the music itself that called to him. He had spent hours practicing, learning the language of notes, the way sound could move hearts. As he grew older, the piano had been his companion through lonely nights, through joys and sorrows that no one else could understand. But life had not always been kind. He remembered days filled with struggle, trying to make ends meet, facing loss after loss. One by one, People he had trusted had left, and the music that once filled his world began to fade. He had put away the piano, put away the dreams, hiding the passion that had once defined him. Slowly, he had become someone cautious, someone who avoided attention, someone who wore a disguise not just in clothing, but in the way he moved through the world. Even now, the disguise was a shield. People looked at him and saw only what he appeared to be, a quiet, unassuming man, easily ignored. They could not see the years of training, the countless hours of practice, the emotions stored deep within him. But he did not mind. For a long time, he had been invisible, and in that invisibility, he had found safety. Yet there had always been a part of him longing to return to the piano, to the place where he had once felt most alive. He thought about the square again, the old piano, the small crowd that had gathered. Their faces, their expressions, the shock and curiosity, he remembered it all. For a brief moment, he had not been invisible. For a few minutes, he had shared a part of himself that no one could ignore, and it had felt good, more than he had expected. It reminded him why he had returned to music after all these years, why the piano had drawn him back. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He could feel the rhythm still within him, the beat of music that never truly left. It had been a long time since he had played freely, without fear, without hesitation. The notes he had pressed, the sound that had traveled across the square, it had been like speaking a language only the heart could understand. That connection was what he had missed the most. As he sat on the bench, he noticed other people in the park. A young man tossed a ball for his dog, laughing loudly. A woman jogged past, her headphones on, lost in her own world. Children ran with kites, their laughter bright and clear. The city was alive, moving forward, indifferent to his presence, but he did not feel disconnected. Instead, he felt part of something larger. A silent observer who understood the beauty in small moments. He pulled out a small notebook from his bag and began to write, jotting down thoughts, fragments of melodies, memories, and feelings. The notebook had traveled with him for years, filled with sketches of songs and ideas that had never been played. Writing was another way to preserve what was inside him, a way to give shape to the emotions he could not always express through sound alone. He wrote slowly, carefully choosing words that matched the quiet depth of his thoughts. Time passed without him noticing. The sun shifted in the sky, casting longer shadows across the park. The air cooled, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above. People moved past, some glancing at the man writing quietly on the bench, others too absorbed in their own lives to notice. Yet he did not feel invisible in the same way as before. There was a sense of purpose now, a quiet determination that had been missing for years. The piano had reminded him that he could still create, still connect, still matter. He thought again about the music. The notes he had played were simple, but they had carried weight, emotion, and story. That was the beauty of it. He did not need applause, fame, or recognition. The act of sharing the music, even for a few minutes, had reminded him of why he had started in the first place. It was not about who watched, but about the truth that the piano could reveal, the truth that had been waiting inside him all along. The man closed his notebook and leaned back on the bench, looking up at the sky. Clouds drifted lazily, and birds moved through the air without concern. Life went on around him, ever busy, ever changing, but he felt a calmness he had not known in a long time. There was a quiet strength in knowing that he still had something to offer, something that could touch others without words, without explanations. The piano had reminded him of that strength, and he was determined not to let it fade again. He stayed there for a while, watching the world, reflecting, and planning. He thought about the next time he might play, about the small moments that could make a difference. Even if no one noticed, even if the crowd had dispersed quickly, he knew that music had power. It could change the air, shift the mood, or simply bring comfort. That was enough for him. Eventually, he stood and continued walking, moving toward the quieter streets, toward the familiar paths he had once known. The city was vast, full of life and sound, yet he carried a sense of peace that could not be disturbed by its chaos. The piano had reminded him that no matter how hidden he might seem, he still had a voice, a story, and a presence that could not be denied. As evening approached, he found himself near an old building, its windows reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. He paused, thinking about the journey that had brought him here.
Ow!
About the moments of loss and discovery, of invisibility and recognition. He realized that the man in disguise was not defined by his clothing or the way others saw him. He was defined by what he carried inside, the music, the memories, the quiet strength to keep moving forward. He adjusted his cap slightly and began to walk again, each step measured, thoughtful, and full of purpose. The city continued its rhythm around him, but he was in his own flow, carrying with him the quiet power of the piano, the reminder that he could always return, always create, always matter. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt a small but steady hope that the next time he touched the keys, the music would carry him even further, revealing more of the man hidden behind the disguise. The next day, the man returned to the square. He moved with the same quiet pace, his cap low, his bag swinging gently at his side. The piano waited in its usual place, worn and silent, as if it knew he would come. A few people were already passing by, but most did not notice him. He had become part of the city's background again, just another figure in the crowd. Yet, he did not mind. He had learned that what mattered was not how people saw him, but the moments he could create when he chose to act. He paused for a moment before sitting down, observing the keys. The memories of yesterday's music filled him, and he felt a quiet thrill. He had been nervous the first time he played publicly, worried that his hands might tremble, that he might falter. But the music had flowed, and in doing so, it had reminded him why he had started. Today felt different. Today he wanted to go a little deeper, to allow the music to speak even more clearly. People began to notice him again. A few lingered nearby, curious, some whispering, "Is it the same man?" Others shrugged and walked on, dismissing him as just another passerby. But the man did not look for recognition. He did not care about the whispers. He cared about the music, the piano, and the connection that could be felt through sound. That was enough for him. He sat down and ran his fingers gently across the keys, testing their response. They were slightly stiff in places, but that did not matter. Each key held the potential for expression, for emotion. He took a deep breath and let his hands find a rhythm. Slowly, a melody began to emerge. It was softer, more delicate than yesterday, but layered with feeling. Each note seemed to carry a memory, a hope, a piece of the man he had hidden for so long. As he played, he felt the music moving through him. It was not just a performance. It was a release. All the weight of the past, the doubts, the fears, the years of silence, seemed to flow through the piano and out into the square. The few people who had stopped began to listen more closely. They could sense that this was different from the usual background music they sometimes heard in public places. This was real, alive, and urgent. A small crowd slowly formed, though they remained respectful and quiet. They did not push forward. They simply let the music reach them. Some closed their eyes, swaying slightly with the rhythm, as if the notes were wrapping around them. Others whispered to companions, remarking on the beauty and intensity of what they were hearing. Children stood still, mesmerized, trying to understand how one person could make a piano speak with such emotion. The man allowed himself to become absorbed in the moment. He did not notice the passage of time, the shifting sunlight, or the slight chill in the air. His mind focused entirely on the sound, on the way each key could tell a story, how one note could echo memories of joy and sorrow alike. Music had always been a language he understood better than words, and now it was speaking louder than ever. With each note, his confidence grew. He played with more freedom, letting his fingers move without hesitation. The melody expanded, flowing into something richer, more complex. He thought about the people in the square, about the reactions that might ripple through them. And yet he played not for them, but for himself and for the music itself. That purity gave his performance a quiet power, one that no applause or recognition could match. The crowd grew more attentive. People who had walked past stopped, some leaning against walls, others crouching slightly to hear better. Their eyes followed his hands as they moved across the keys, captivated by the fluidity and grace of his playing. It was not flashy or showy. There were no dramatic flourishes, no attempt to impress. Every note was deliberate, carrying weight and meaning. A woman in the crowd glanced at those around her and whispered softly, "Do you hear that? It's incredible." A man standing nearby nodded slowly, unable to take his eyes off the piano. Even the children sensed something extraordinary. The music was not just sound. It was a story unfolding in real time, a story that touched each listener in a personal way. It was a language without words, understood instinctively by anyone willing to listen. As the performance continued, the man began to experiment, combining gentle chords with faster sequences, exploring the piano's full range. His fingers moved confidently, drawing out sounds that had been hidden beneath the worn keys. The square seemed to transform around him. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the resonance of the piano, the connection between one man and everyone listening. For a few moments, the world outside ceased to matter. There was only music, only presence, only the quiet intensity of someone pouring their soul into sound. He felt a strange exhilaration as he played, a mixture of relief, joy, and quiet pride. He was no longer invisible, not because of attention or applause, but because the music made him seen in a way that words could never do. People were noticing not his appearance, not his clothes, not the assumptions they might make, but the depth of his talent and the honesty of his expression. That was a rare, fleeting kind of recognition, one that resonated far deeper than surface-level praise. Time seemed to bend as the man continued. He explored themes he had practiced long ago, melodies he had written in solitude, even improvised small sequences that felt spontaneous and alive. Each note built upon the last, weaving a story of longing, resilience, and quiet strength. Listeners were drawn in, some moving closer cautiously, others remaining at a respectful distance, but all sensing the power of the moment. The man played as though speaking directly to each person, yet without words, allowing them to find their own meanings in the music. Finally, he slowed, letting the notes become softer, more reflective. His hands hovered briefly over the keys, as if savoring the last traces of sound. Then he pressed the final notes, letting them linger in the air before fading into silence. The square was quiet for a long beat, almost holding its breath. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It was soft at first, hesitant, then growing stronger as people recognized the depth of what they had just experienced. The man nodded slightly, acknowledging the quiet recognition. He did not speak, did not ask for attention. The music had said everything. He allowed himself a brief smile, a small acknowledgement of satisfaction. This was why he had returned, why he had embraced the piano once more. Not for fame, not for validation, but for the simple, pure connection that music could create. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring to one another, he stood and gathered his bag. He adjusted his cap and took one last glance at the piano, now silent and waiting. He walked away slowly, blending once more into the city, a quiet figure with a story only the music could tell. Though unseen by most, he carried with him the knowledge that he had shared something meaningful, something that could linger in the hearts of those who had listened. The man disappeared into the streets, leaving the square behind, but the echoes of his performance remained. The piano, old and worn, had been awakened again, and the memory of its sound would stay with the few who had paused to listen. For him, it was not the recognition or applause that mattered most, but the reaffirmation that he could still create, still touch lives, and still find his voice, hidden beneath the quiet disguise of a man who simply loved to play. The following day, the man returned once again, though he walked more slowly this time, as if anticipating what the piano might bring. The square was quiet, more so than usual, and the old piano sat alone, waiting. He approached it with a sense of purpose that had grown within him over the past days. It was no longer just an instrument. It had become a companion, a place where he could express everything he had kept hidden for years. He placed his bag down, adjusted his cap, and ran his fingers across the keys. feeling their uneven surfaces, the texture of the worn wood, the slight stickiness of a key here and there. Every imperfection reminded him that beauty could be found in what was old. What had been overlooked? A few people had already gathered at the square, more curious than cautious this time. Whispers moved through the crowd. Is it him again? Yes, he's the one from yesterday. Children peered from behind their parents, and a young man leaned against a wall, holding a camera ready to capture the moment. The man in disguise did not seek attention, but he did not ignore it either. He knew people were watching, waiting, expecting, but he had learned to focus only on the music and on himself. That was where the real connection lived. He sat on the piano bench and closed his eyes for a moment. His mind wandered through memories of the past, of days when he had practiced tirelessly. The sound of the piano echoing through empty rooms. He remembered the joy, the heartbreak, and the quiet determination that had kept him coming back to music. Those feelings flooded him now, not as pain, but as strength. They were the fuel for the performance he was about to give. He pressed the first key. The sound was soft at first, almost hesitant, but full of warmth and intention. He let his hands move naturally, exploring the instrument, coaxing out a melody that was delicate, yet deeply expressive. The notes were not hurried. They were measured, deliberate, each one carrying a weight that went beyond the surface. The square seemed to listen with him, the wind slowing, the distant sounds of the city fading away, leaving only the music. The crowd grew steadily. More people had stopped to watch. Some had recognized him from the previous days. Others had simply been drawn by the sound. They stayed silent, giving space to the music. Even the children seemed captivated, standing still, their eyes wide. Adults held their breath, listening, sensing that this performance was different, more profound. There was a stillness in the air that demanded respect and attention. He allowed himself to feel everything as he played the joy. The sorrow, the moments of doubt and triumph he had carried all these years. His fingers danced over the keys with skill and emotion, creating patterns that spoke without words. The music was alive, growing in depth and complexity with every note. It was no longer just a melody. It was a story, one that each person listening could interpret in their own way. It was about loss and hope, about fear and courage, about a life hidden under a quiet exterior. A few onlookers exchanged glances, visibly moved by the sound. Some had tears forming in their eyes, others nodded, feeling the emotions without needing to understand them completely. The man did not notice the reactions directly. He was fully absorbed, lost in the music, letting it flow through him and fill the space around him. Each note resonated like a heartbeat, a pulse that connected him to the crowd in a way that words never could. As the music grew, he experimented with dynamics, moving from soft, gentle phrases to louder, more intense sequences. The piano responded to his touch, producing sounds that were rich, layered, and full of expression, despite its age and wear. The crowd could feel it, the change in energy, the rise and fall of tension and release. They were no longer mere spectators. They were part of the experience. Carried along by the man's mastery and the honesty in his playing, he paused briefly at one point, letting a single note hang in the air. The silence that followed was almost deafening, and he could feel the attention of every person in the square. It was a shared moment, a pause that held as much meaning as the notes themselves. Then, he continued, building the melody into something more intricate, weaving patterns that felt both familiar and new. The music seemed to have a life of its own, telling a story that transcended time and circumstance. People were visibly affected. Some reached out to touch the piano almost instinctively, while others stood back, entranced by the sound. Conversations had stopped entirely. The children whispered softly to their parents, not wanting to break the spell. Even the young man with the camera lowered it, captivated by the performance rather than trying to capture it. Every listener felt something personal in the music, something that resonated with their own experiences and emotions. The man's expression was calm, almost serene, yet his hands moved with purpose and precision. Each note he played seemed to release a small part of the burden he had carried for so long. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a conduit for everything he had held inside, a way to communicate the unspoken, to express the emotions that words could never convey. And the crowd, in turn, felt privileged to witness it, even if only for a few fleeting minutes. Minutes passed, and the music became softer, more introspective. He explored slower, more thoughtful melodies, allowing the emotions to settle and resonate. The crowd remained silent, sensing that this was the culmination of something greater than a simple performance. The air was heavy with feeling, with the shared understanding that they had been touched by something rare and authentic. This was not entertainment. It was a moment of human connection, a bridge between the man and everyone listening. Finally, he brought the piece to a close. The last notes lingered in the air, fading gently as he rested his hands on the keys. There was a moment of profound silence, as if the square itself was holding its breath. Then, softly at first, the crowd began to applaud. The sound grew steadily, filling the space, but the man did not rise immediately. He let the applause wash over him quietly, acknowledging it with a small nod, but not seeking it. The music had said everything that needed to be said. He stood slowly, gathered his bag, and took one last look at the piano. The bench creaked under him as he left, the worn instrument once again silent, but alive with the echoes of the performance. The crowd lingered, talking softly among themselves. Some recording on their phones, others simply reflecting on what they had heard. Even after he was gone, the impression of the music remained, leaving a sense of awe and quiet wonder. As he walked away, blending into the streets, he felt a deep satisfaction. The piano had given him a voice when words were insufficient. It had allowed him to share a part of himself that had been hidden for so long. And in doing so, it had touched others in ways that were profound and lasting. He did not know if he would return the next day or if anyone would remember him, but that did not matter. What mattered was the connection, the shared experience, and the reminder that music had the power to reveal truth and beauty where it was least expected. The man continued down the quiet streets, the evening sun casting long shadows behind him. The city continued its rhythm, oblivious to the quiet miracle that had taken place in its midst, but he carried the memory with him. Every note, every pause, every subtle emotion in the music was etched in his mind, a testament to the power of persistence, patience, and quiet dedication. And as he walked, he felt a growing certainty that the piano, the music, and the man in disguise were bound together in a way that could not be undone. A bond that would continue to grow with each encounter, each melody, each shared moment of humanity. The man did not return to the square for several days. He wandered the city streets quietly, observing life unfolding in small, unnoticed ways. Children chasing pigeons, shopkeepers closing their doors, street vendors calling out for customers. Everything seemed ordinary to those passing by, but he saw stories hidden in each moment. Life moved quickly around him, yet he carried the memory of the piano and the music that had connected him to the people in the square. He thought often about the faces, the expressions, the silence, and the subtle nods of appreciation he had received. It was a quiet recognition, but one that meant more than any words could express. Eventually, he felt the pull of the piano again. It had become a part of him, something essential he could not ignore. He returned to the square slowly, deliberately, as if preparing himself for a final performance, though he did not call it that. The piano awaited, faithful and silent, as though it had anticipated his arrival. He placed his bag on the ground, adjusted his cap, and approached the keys with a sense of reverence. Today, he would play not just for himself, but for the people who might witness it. For anyone willing to pause and listen, the crowd was already forming, more diverse than before. Regular passersby recognized him and stopped. Newcomers glanced curiously at the man in worn clothes, the quiet figure who had somehow captured the attention of so many. Children peeked from behind their parents, while some adults whispered quietly, wondering what kind of music would emerge this time. The man did not need to look at them. He could feel their presence, their anticipation, without a single word spoken. He breathed deeply and let his fingers rest lightly on the keys, feeling the familiar texture. The slight imperfections that gave the piano character. He began slowly, with a gentle melody that seemed almost hesitant, yet carried a depth that immediately drew the listeners in. His hands moved naturally, guided by years of practice and emotions stored within him. The music grew steadily, each note layered with subtle emotion, each chord a reflection of experience, struggle, and hope. He was no longer playing to prove anything. He was playing to express, to connect, to allow the world to see a fragment of the person he had been hiding for so long. The crowd held their breath. People watched in silence, captivated by the beauty of the sound and the presence of the man. Even those who had doubted him before were now unable to turn away. The children listened with wide eyes, feeling the rhythm in their chests, understanding the story in their own way. The adults too felt the weight of the music, a gentle but undeniable pull at their hearts. It was more than entertainment. It was an experience, something real and human, raw and unpull. As the melody deepened, he allowed himself to explore more complex sequences, moving his hands with a fluidity that made it seem as if the music were an extension of his very being. The piano responded with a richness and clarity that surprised even him, each note resonating with power and emotion. He had not realized just how much he had missed this, how much he had yearned to return to the keys and let the music speak without interruption. Today it was not just a performance, it was a reunion with himself, a final acknowledgement of the passion that had shaped him. The crowd felt it too. A hush settled over the square, as if the world had paused. Conversations stopped, movements slowed, and every pair of eyes followed the motion of his hands. Some people had tears in their eyes, moved by the purity and honesty of the music. Others simply listened, letting the melody wash over them, feeling the emotions rise and fall with the cadence of each note. The man did not play for applause or recognition, yet he received both in abundance. It came not from expectation, but from the sheer impact of his expression. He continued for what felt like hours, though time passed unnoticed. Each note, each chord was deliberate, yet carried spontaneity and life. The music told a story of resilience, of persistence, of quiet strength hidden behind appearances. It spoke of loneliness, struggle, hope, and renewal. The crowd, though silent, absorbed every moment, understanding something fundamental about human experience through sound alone. In the hands of the man in disguise, the piano had become a voice capable of speaking directly to the heart. Gradually, the melody softened. He slowed his pace, letting the notes stretch, linger, and fade naturally. The music became reflective, almost conversational, as if sharing a secret with every listener. People leaned in, sensing the intimacy of the moment. The children shifted closer to their parents. The adults tilted their heads, absorbing every nuance. The music was both delicate and powerful. A final gift from someone who had hidden his true self for so long but had now revealed it fully. If only for a few fleeting minutes, finally. The last notes faded into the stillness of the square. The man rested his hands lightly on the keys, letting the silence speak. The crowd remained quiet for a heartbeat, processing what they had witnessed. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began, soft at first, hesitant, then building steadily. People clapped, some cheered quietly, and a few even whistled in amazement. But the man did not rise immediately. He let the moment settle, acknowledging the appreciation with a subtle nod, as though it were enough for him to know the music had been heard, had reached the hearts of those present. He stood slowly, dusting his clothes lightly, and gathered his bag. The applause continued, but he did not look for it, did not linger to accept it. His focus had always been on the music itself, on the connection it created, and on the personal fulfillment it brought. With a quiet, deliberate step, he turned and walked away, blending into the streets once more. The square remained alive with the echoes of the music, the memory of what had just taken place lingering in the hearts and minds of everyone present as he walked. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the early days of practice, the long periods of silence, the doubt, the disguise, and finally, the courage to return. The music had always been his companion, his confidant, his voice when words were insufficient. Today, it had been more than that. It had been a bridge connecting him to strangers in a way that no conversation could achieve. It was a reminder that talent, passion, and authenticity could shine even in unexpected places, and that one moment of bravery could leave a lasting impact on those who were present. The man continued walking, slowly merging with the flow of the city. The sun was low, casting long shadows, painting the streets in shades of gold and amber. People moved past him, unaware of the quiet miracle that had taken place in their midst. Yet he carried it within himself, fully aware of its significance. The piano, old and worn, had been awakened, and its music had spoken more clearly than ever before. He had reclaimed a part of himself and shared it with the world, leaving an invisible mark that would resonate long after he had gone. He knew he might never return to that square again, or that the crowd might never gather in the same way. It did not matter. The music had fulfilled its purpose, had spoken the truths that needed to be told. The man in disguise, once invisible and overlooked, had revealed a part of his soul, and in doing so, had reminded himself and everyone who had listened that beauty, courage, and talent could emerge from the most unexpected places. And with that knowledge, he walked on, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of a story told without words, a life expressed through music, and a final understanding that one moment, one note, could change everything. Weeks had passed since the man had last touched the piano in the square. Life in the city continued at its usual pace, full of noise, movement, and constant change. Yet, in a quiet corner of his mind, the music lingered, an unspoken presence that refused to fade. He wandered the streets, observing life with the same quiet attentiveness as always. People hustled past him, unaware of the moments he had created, the emotions he had shared. And yet, the memory of the piano and the music it had produced remained vivid, a gentle reminder of something larger than himself. One morning, he found himself near a small music store tucked between taller buildings. Its windows displayed instruments of every kind: violins, guitars, flutes, and of course, a few small keyboards. He paused, drawn in by the sight. There was a sense of possibility in the air, feeling that perhaps the piano was not the only way to reach out, to connect, to express. The man stepped inside quietly, greeted by the faint scent of polished wood and the soft hum of distant music. The storekeeper noticed him immediately. He was a kind-eyed man, older, with a calm demeanor. "Looking for something special?" he asked. The man only shook his head slightly, unsure of what he sought. He wandered past the rows of instruments, feeling their presence, running his fingers lightly over strings and keys, listening to the subtle tones each produced. There was a certain magic in the possibility of creation, in the quiet potential that lay within each instrument. He eventually stopped before a small upright piano in the corner. Unlike the public piano in the square, this one was polished and cared for, its keys smooth and responsive. He lifted the cover slowly and let his fingers hover above the keys. It felt familiar, yet new. The potential for music was infinite here, waiting for him to explore. He pressed a single note, letting it resonate in the room. The sound was pure, clear, and full of possibility. A smile crossed his face, faint and quiet, but real. Over the next few days, he returned to the store repeatedly. The storekeeper did not question him, did not rush him, allowing him the freedom to explore. The man began to experiment, combining melodies he had remembered from his time at the public piano with new ideas that came to him in the solitude of the store. He wrote small pieces in a notebook he had brought along, crafting the beginnings of compositions that he might one day share. Each day, his confidence grew. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that music was not just a public performance, but a private journey as well. Word of the man in disguise had begun to spread quietly in the city. A few people from the square had shared videos and stories of his performances. Some called him mysterious. Others simply referred to him as the quiet pianist who could bring the square to silence with his music. The man remained unaware of most of this attention, focused entirely on his exploration of sound and the connection he felt to each note he played. The music was his voice, unspoken but deeply understood, and that was enough. One day, while experimenting with a piece that combined gentle chords and flowing arpeggios, a young boy entered the store. His eyes widened as he saw the man at the piano. He stood silently, watching, captivated. The man noticed him, paused for a moment, and offered a small nod. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet invitation. The boy hesitated, then stepped closer, and the man motioned for him to try. Hesitant fingers pressed the keys, producing small, awkward notes. The man smiled gently and guided the boy's hands, showing him subtle ways to press the keys. How to feel the music in his fingers? The boy's eyes lit up with excitement. And he played a small melody, a simple tune, but filled with joy. The man listened, nodding encouragingly, letting the boy know that music was not about perfection, but about feeling, expression, and connection. The storekeeper watched from a distance, quietly impressed. The man's presence had transformed the space into something more than a store. It had become a place of learning, sharing, inspiration. Over the next weeks, more children, and even adults, began to trickle into the store, drawn by curiosity and word of mouth. Each person was welcomed quietly, encouraged to explore, to create, to play without fear or judgment. The man in disguise became more than a performer. He became a teacher, a mentor, and a guide for those seeking to understand music in its purest form. He taught not through strict instructions, but through example, through patience, through showing that music was as much about the heart as it was about the hands. He began to compose new pieces, inspired by the people around him. Melodies that carried the laughter of children, the gentle murmur of the city, and the quiet strength he had found within himself. Each composition was a reflection of life, simple yet profound, approachable yet filled with depth. The notebook that had accompanied him for years grew thicker, filled with scores, sketches, and ideas waiting to be played. The man felt a quiet satisfaction he had never known before. His music was not only a voice for himself, but a gift for others. Evenings were often spent sitting quietly in the store, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. Occasionally, a passerby would peek through the window, drawn by the sound of a new melody emerging. The man did not seek attention, but he did not hide from it either. Music had a way of drawing people in naturally, and he had learned that connection did not need words. It was enough to play, to share, to let the notes carry meaning that transcended speech. One afternoon, as a gentle rain began to fall outside, the man sat at the piano. A small group of children gathered around. They listened intently as he played a soft, flowing piece, the notes dancing lightly, echoing the rhythm of raindrops against the window pane. The children closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, feeling it as an embrace. The man watched them carefully, seeing their reactions, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he had always sought, the ability to connect, to touch lives, to share a language that needed no translation. Time passed quickly, and the man began to notice subtle changes within himself. The quiet confidence he had rediscovered at the public piano was growing into a steady presence. He no longer felt the same hesitation or fear. The music had become a companion, a teacher, a friend. He had discovered that the true power of his gift was not in the applause of a crowd or the attention of strangers, but in the small, profound moments of connection with those who were willing to listen and learn. Word spread further, and occasionally adults who had once dismissed him came to the store, curious about the quiet man who had captured the hearts of so many. They watched, listened, and some even tried to play, discovering the joy of sound and expression. The man encouraged them gently, showing patience and respect, letting them find their own voice within the piano. Each person left with a small piece of understanding, a spark of inspiration that lingered long after they had gone. The city outside continued to move quickly, often oblivious to the quiet transformations happening within the store. And yet the man knew that the music he shared, the lives he touched, and the confidence he nurtured in others would ripple outward in ways unseen. He had become a hidden force of connection, subtle yet powerful, and it was enough. Each day, each note, each lesson was a continuation of the journey he had begun. A story that was still unfolding, a melody that would never truly end. Months passed, and the man had become a quiet presence in the city, not through fame or recognition, but through the subtle influence of his music. The small music store had become his sanctuary, a place where he could explore melodies freely and share them with those willing to listen. Children, young adults, even a few elderly visitors had come to recognize him as someone who could unlock the language of sound, not with words but with patience, guidance, and understanding. One morning, the man arrived at the store to find a group of children waiting outside. Their eyes lit up as they spotted him, and they waved eagerly. Some had been coming for weeks, others had heard from friends, and decided to see what it was all about. The man smiled faintly beneath his cap and nodded. He welcomed them quietly, allowing them to enter one by one. The store had grown slightly more crowded over the months, and every corner now held the soft resonance of potential music. He began the day by showing them a simple exercise, pressing a series of keys slowly and deliberately, explaining how each note could be shaped with intention. The children watched closely, trying to imitate him. He encouraged them gently, correcting a hand position here, a finger pressure there, always patient, always calm. It was not about perfection. It was about expression, about feeling the sound, about learning the quiet power of music. The store, filled with the soft tones of practice, became a classroom of the heart rather than just technique.